Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy. This is session 5. The title is Lack of Trust. The text is Numbers 20, verses 1 through 13. And the lesson summary statement is God calls his people to trust him in every situation. I'm using, to introduce the lesson, the suggestion that's in the Leader's Guidebook on page 59, where you ask them to read a paragraph out of the personal study guide. You may want to make copies of that to provide it for people who don't have that, and then the follow-up questions that come from that. And then that's going to lead me into talking to them about the context. The entire section of these chapters 15 to chapter 20, is really an illustration of our lesson summary statement in that God calls his people to trust him in every situation. Chapter 15 talks about various offerings, and it's basically saying the way in which you approach God is through these offerings. You need to trust him and follow those procedures. Then chapter 16 and 17 is about God's priests. And if God's priests are faithful and the people follow God's priests, then Israel's going to know the blessings and the promises that God has made to them. But there's a challenge to God's priests, and it comes from the Kohathites, and they're judged for it, and the priesthood of Aaron is affirmed. Chapters 18 and 19 is about various directions about the Levites, things like how they're to be provided for. They're assigned the responsibility of being guardians of the holiness of the sanctuary. It goes into other requirements like these are the procedures you go through from being cleansed after you've touched the dead. And again, it's a lot of details, but it's basically saying in all these different situations, trust God and obey his instructions. And then we come to chapter 20. Chapter 20 begins with the death of Miriam in verse 1, and it ends with the death of Aaron in verses 23 to 29. And in between is detailed Moses and Aaron's disobedience and in their command to give water to the people. Now, Moses has assembled the people back at Kadesh. Kadesh is the place where the spies were sent out. Kadesh is the place of the great sin of the nation of Israel that has resulted in an entire generation dying out because of their unbelief and their refusal to obey God. And so this scene is taking place at that place where it took place 40 years ago. So the question seems to be hanging in the air. Is this second generation, are they going to be faithful and obey God? Or are they going to rebel and disobey God like the second generation? And it starts out and it's almost like it's happening all over again. So the first point of our lesson is the problem. God calls his people to trust him in every situation. So I want to say to the class, the title of this is The Problem. So let's pinpoint the problem. And I want to do this by approaching it with different kind of layers. First of all, I want us to read the text, and then I want to ask them, what are the physical and geographical problems? And of course, the problem is there's no water. In fact, the word water occurs several times in our Sunday school text because it provides the context, the situation in which God's people are being tested. And it's interesting that the solution is going to be a rock. That seems to be the way God works. Now, Kadesh was a place that was known for lots of springs of water. And so you could imagine the concern that people have when they arrive at this place that is known for water and there's no water. We don't know why there's no water. Maybe there's been a drought, or maybe the crowd is so large that they have consumed what water was available. It could have been any number of reasons, but the bottom line is there's not enough water for the people. And so that's the geographical issue. That's the geographical, physical problem. Secondly, I want want us to explore what's the emotional, relational problem that's happening here. And again, you might, as they give answers, you might be able to point out passages of scripture. For example, the people are angry. It says in verse 2, there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. And that word against reflects hostility and angry. They are very upset, and you could understand why there would be this kind of contentious spirit within them, because there's no water. They're getting thirsty. Their family's in need. Notice it says they quarreled with Moses. That reveals as I mentioned, a contentious, disputing spirit. They are distraught. There's no water. They to the point where they say, listen to this exaggeration. They wish they had died. They're grumbling people. That's another thing I want the people to see. They're grumbling, and when people are grumblers, they tend to exaggerate. They tend to blame or magnify, and you can see that in this passage as well. And then after we've peeled off that layer of what's happening with the people emotionally, I want us to look at what's happening to the people spiritually. And when we read through the text, what is it that we could understand about the Israelites at this time? And obviously, they have a rebellious nature. God has brought them to this place, and they're not willing to trust Him. They're questioning God's goodness. They didn't see their survival as a blessing. They have forgotten God's provisions. I'm wanting to, what I'm trying to do with the class is I'm trying to move it closer and closer to the real issue that's driving it. There isn't concern about the physical and the geographical, but God has led them there. And so what the real issue is spiritual, their relationship and their ability to trust God. Because the lesson is driving at this point. God calls His people to trust Him in every situation. So after I've done that, I want to point out to the class several examples in the scriptures where some of the heroes of our faith experienced the same thing in terms of physical or geographical problems or emotional and relational problems, and yet spiritually they responded differently. And I'm just going to mention them to kind of set the table for what I'm wanting to do in terms of applying it. For example, Joseph was rejected by his brothers. He was wrongfully accused. He was sent to prison. That's some terrible circumstances. And yet Joseph always kept his faith in God. Daniel refused to compromise his faith, and as a result of that, he was thrown into a lion's den. And there was political intrigue. There were enemies that were against Daniel, that lied about him. And then there's Job. Job lost almost everything. He lost almost everything but his faith, and he suffered greatly, worse than most people have ever even imagined. And yet Job, even though he struggled, he still kept his faith in God. And then there's Paul and Silas. They were beaten and thrown into jail. But all of these people trusted God even when the circumstances appeared bleak. So I'm asking the class, what's the difference between the heroes of the faith and the faithless Israelites? Because what we want to be like are the heroes of the faith who had terrible experiences, terrible environment, had people against them, everything working against them, and yet they held on to their faith. But these Israelites seem to be giving it up so easy. So I'm asking, what's the difference between these? And some of the things I'm looking for is the heroes of the faith, they kept connected to God. When you read their stories, they're praying, they're worshiping, they're believing the promises of the word. They trusted God's character. God would not lie to them. They trusted God's promises. He said He would do this, and He does not lie. They trusted God's purposes. They told themselves the truth. So the problem is confronted with either faith or faithlessness. Now, the second point of the lesson is the plan, verse 6 through 8. And again, I want to go through the text and give some explanation of it. Verse 6, then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting. So they stepped away from this angry mob and they went before the Lord and they humbled themselves. They're being accused and attacked by the crowd. And so what is their response? Not to accuse and attack, but their response was to humble themselves before God and to pray and to intercede. That's a good approach. Verse 7, the Lord spoke to Moses and he tells Moses three things. Take the staff represents the authority of God, and assemble the community. The word assemble there is a word that refers to a religious gathering. So this is going to have a spiritual impact. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock while they watch. Now, so they are to see the power of God in this demonstration, and it will yield water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock. Now, I'm asking the class, on the face of it, what's the basic plan? Well, the basic plan is to provide water. And when you step back from the text and get a bigger view of the context, what is God's plan for these people? So initially, just reading the text, okay, they need water, God's going to give them water. But what's really taking place here on a bigger scale, on a broader stage? And what I'm wanting the class to see is God's calling his people to trust him in every situation, because they're going to need to do that. They're going to need to learn that. What's coming for the Israelites? We know what's coming, but they don't know what's coming. So what is it that's coming for them in terms of situations in which they're going to need to trust God? And your class can add to that. One of the things is they're going to be asked to cross the Jordan River at flood stage. And the Jordan River, when it's flooding, the word Jordan means descender. It's because it describes how steep the river is from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. And when it's flooding, normally it's 100 miles meandering, but when it's flooding, it's 60 miles, and the stream can flow so fast that it has been known to roll boulders down the river. And it's at that time that God says to them, I want you to step out in the water and cross to the other side. And so that's coming. They're going to need to trust God in that kind of event. Then there's Jericho. What kind of a military plan is this? March around it one time and blow your horn. And then on the seventh day, march around it 7 times and blow your horn. I mean, it's an unbelievable kind of plan. But are they going to obey God in this event? Then there's the sun standing still. There's just a whole host of things in the book of Joshua that they're going to be asked to trust God in some very unusual events. That's what's happening here. Now, I want to write on the board this statement. Israel's greatest need was not water, but to honor God as holy and trustworthy as revealed in their obedience. I want to write that statement on the board, and then I want to erase Israel, and I want to put in the word America, and I want to erase the word water and ask for their suggestions. For example, America's greatest need was not, and then put a blank there, but to honor God as holy and trustworthy as revealed in their obedience. What would America answer that way? America's greatest need was not economy or military or whatever the class may suggest, whatever it is that America believes, but the greatest need of America is to honor God as holy and trustworthy as revealed in their obedience. And then I want to erase the word America, and I want to substitute friend. someone they know. And if they could speak honestly with them, how would they complete this statement? My friend's greatest need is not, and then fill that in. I ask for suggestions. What is it that they think of when they think of a particular friend? But what your friend's greatest need is to honor God as holy and trustworthy as revealed in their obedience. And then, of course, the last one is me. My greatest need is not, and then I'm going to ask them to think of what that is. They don't have to share it. I just want them to think about that. But that's not your greatest need. Your greatest need is to honor God as holy and trustworthy as revealed in their obedience. Because this lesson is wanting us to understand God calls his people to trust him in every situation. Now that brings us to the third point of our lesson, and that is the result. Numbers chapter 20, verses 9 to 13. And I want to read through the text with some explanation because there's so much here. Verse 9, so Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he had commanded him. So far, so good. And this phrase, just as he commanded him, is a frequent phrase found in the book of Exodus when it speaks about Moses. Moses was a man of obedience. So far, so good. Verse 10, Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock. Now that's good as well, because this is exactly what God told them to do. And then things began to change. And Moses said to. Now, what's he supposed to speak to? He's supposed to speak to the rock. But he's not speaking to the rock. It says Moses said to them. This is where things get off track. He's not supposed to speak to Israel. He's supposed to speak to the rock. But he speaks to Israel and he says, listen, you rebels. It's talking about people who are obstinate, people who just have this inward resistance to God and who want to disobey God. It's interesting, this word rebel is going to be used of Moses himself when this story is retold later in chapter 20, verse 24, and in chapter 27, I believe it's verse 14. It's going to use this word to describe Moses and Aaron. In other words, what he's accusing them of is he has become. Now he goes on to say, not only are you rebels, notice, must we bring water out of this rock for you. The word bring is an accusative. It's meaning, do we have to deliver this again? Moses is taking credit for delivering the water. Now, he did this in Exodus 17, and the people were without water, and they complained to Moses, and Moses prays to God, and God says to him that he is to strike a particular rock. And so God says, my glory will be in front of that rock. And so it's an interesting text because to strike the rock, he strikes through the glory of God. So God is taking the punishment that people deserved for their rebellion in order for them to receive the life-giving stream. And here, that is not what's going to happen, but Moses uses that past experience. Verse 11, then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. So in grace, God still provides for them. Notice he doesn't say that he provided them water. It says he provided them abundant water and it gushed out. Someone has calculated that the amount of water they would need to provide for that large number of people, plus their livestock, you see, he added that in there, would be something like 5,000 gallons a minute. So if you, from Sunday school or from Vacation Bible School, you have this image of a nice stream that's flowing out from a rock to provide for the people, that would not be the picture that is here. I mean, it is gushing out a tremendous amount of water to provide for them. Verse 12. So God's going to punish him. He gives the reason why in verse 12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites. That's the crime. That's the sin. God was wanting to demonstrate himself as a God of power and provision. God was wanting them to understand that when they get into the promised land, they have a God who can bring water from a rock. And if he can bring water from a rock to quench the thirst of these millions of people, plus their livestock, then he's more than enough to handle whatever troubles they may find, whatever situations they find. And he's saying to Moses, you stole that. You diminished that. And the reason you did that is you didn't believe me. You didn't trust me. Now, sometimes we read this story and we think that this seems to be excessive in terms of the judgment that falls on Moses, because what happens is Moses can't go into the promised land after this. But probably what it really should reveal to us is we tend to diminish our sin and we tend to not elevate the holiness of God. Moses and Aaron, wonderful leaders, but they did something that was tragic, something that was awful. He says, you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites. You will not bring this assembly into the land I have given them. The very purpose of your life, the very promise that you were going to go into, you forfeited that, Moses. Verse 13, these are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord. And notice this, and he demonstrated his holiness to them. Now God is going to demonstrate his greatness, his holiness. It is either going to be through our obedience or our correction. The Israelites needed to know that they had only one God to depend on when they got into the promised land. The scholars tell us that the way in which Moses approached this could have been comparable to the way magicians said that they used the gods, promoted the gods, manipulated the gods to give things to the people. And it could be that what's happening here is God is saying, you're not going into the promised land. They're not going to trust you, Moses. They're going to look to me and they're going to trust me. Israel can have only one God when it gets into the promised land. Now, the application point for this one says a believer should recognize that ignoring God's instructions leads to consequences. So God makes commands that sometimes seem unreasonable to us. So what are the consequences if we don't obey, but we do our own thing? So there are some commands that God gives us, and it may seem as unreasonable to us as what striking a rock for water seemed to Moses. Let me give you some 5 of these and tell me what the consequences are if we don't obey what seems to be an unreasonable demand from God. You may want to have someone read these texts while you mention them. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 says, love your enemies. That is so unreasonable. That is so unusual. What are the consequences to God's people if we refuse to love our enemies? Number 2, turn the other cheek. Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. Non-retaliation defies common instinct of self-defense and retribution. And yet God says that my people are not to be people who retaliate. Vengeance is mine. So what are the consequences of Christians who will not turn the other cheek? Number 3, giving thanks in all circumstances. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 18. Doesn't that seem unreasonable? Doesn't it seem unreasonable to give thanks in all circumstances? Now, he doesn't say give thanks for that particular trouble, but he says in the midst of it, you can have a thankful spirit. What are the consequences if we're not thankful people? Number 4, forgive 70 times 7, Matthew chapter 8, verse 21 to 22. What are the consequences if we're not people who forgive and forgive and forgive. And number 5, rejoice in suffering. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. It reflects trust in God's redemptive purpose. What's the consequences if we don't live that way? And what I'm hoping to accomplish is to put us in the same kind of a situation where Moses was, in the sense that God gave him this instruction, just speak to the rock. And Moses refused to trust God to do that, and he experienced the consequences of it. Now, to close the lesson, I'm going to ask for a volunteer, and I'll take a little bowl of water or something, and I'm going to say storms are going to come into every Christian's life, and then I'm going to sprinkle some water on their head. So I'll use a man in my class and not a woman, and I'll say you can't avoid that. Every Christian life is going to experience the storms, and then I'm going to hand them an umbrella and sprinkle water on their head, or maybe use a spray bottle and spray some water. And I'm going to say the umbrella doesn't stop the rain. It just provides protection. And we're going to experience events that everyone in life that lives in a sinful world are going to experience. Trusting God doesn't remove those challenges to our life. But trusting God can provide us comfort, it can provide us protection, it can provide us peace in the midst of the storm. And so one of the most important lessons that God wants his people to know is they can trust him in every situation. God bless you, friend. You're going to help a lot of people with this lesson. Thank you for teaching the Word of God.